They called him the Axe Murderer. Wanderlei Silva wasn't just a fighter. He was chaos in human form. From stomping opponents in Japan to feuding with the UFC, his career is legendary, but also haunted. Behind the wild knockouts and brawls lies a story of glory, scandal, and one controversy that nearly erased his name forever. With the recent viral brawl in the ring, he remains one of the most talked about fighters from the Pride era. Let's break it all down, starting from the beginning. Wanderlei Silva's story begins in Curitiba, Brazil, a city known for grit and survival. Growing up in the 1970s and 80s, Silva was no stranger to hardship. The neighborhoods were rough, poverty was widespread, and street fights weren't rare. They were part of daily life. Wanderlei didn't just learn how to fight, he learned why people fought. It was survival, reputation, and pride, all rolled into one. His parents, working tirelessly to provide for their family, wanted stability for their son, but Wanderlei was drawn to combat. As a teenager, he found martial arts, first boxing, then Muay Thai, and eventually Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What started as discipline quickly turned into obsession. Coaches noticed his intensity. He wasn't just training to improve, he was training like every session was a real fight. It was in the bare-knuckle world of Vale Tudo, Brazil's no-rules fight scene, that Silva began to sharpen his weapon. Vale Tudo was brutal, often with few gloves, limited rules, and fights held in small gyms or local events. Here, Wanderlei thrived. He was aggressive, relentless, and unafraid of pain. Those early experiences in Vale Tudo didn't just shape his skills, they created the aura of the Axe Murderer. Even in those early days, Silva's ferocity was unmatched. When he walked toward opponents, his stare was enough to make some hesitate. He wasn't just fighting for victory, he was fighting to destroy. And soon, the MMA world beyond Brazil would take notice of the violent force emerging from Curitiba. In 1998, Wanderlei Silva made his UFC debut at UFC Brazil. It wasn't the dominant win he wanted. He lost to Vitor Belfort in just 44 seconds. For some fighters, that kind of setback would have broken their momentum. For Wanderlei, it was fuel. He returned to Brazil, rededicated himself, and leaned even further into the wild, aggressive style that was becoming his signature. His fights in Brazil and Japan earned him a reputation. Wanderlei didn't just compete, he destroyed. He pressured opponents until they crumbled, swarming them with hooks, knees, and elbows. His nickname, the Axe Murderer, wasn't just clever branding, it was a description. Fans saw his intensity, his brutal finishes, and the chaos he brought, and the name stuck. In these years, Silva began to understand that fighting was more than technique. It was intimidation. When he glared at opponents during weigh-ins, it wasn't an act, it was who he was. His stare became iconic, his entrances filled with menace, and his fights promised mayhem. But while his UFC debut had been a disappointment, destiny was calling from the East. Pride Fighting Championships in Japan was beginning to dominate the global MMA scene, and they were looking for fighters who could thrill audiences. Silva was exactly what they wanted: violent, unrelenting, and unpredictable. And once he stepped into Pride's ring, Wanderlei Silva would become something even bigger, a legend. When Wanderlei Silva signed with Pride in 1999, few could have predicted what was coming. Japan loved spectacle, and Silva was the perfect storm: explosive knockouts, a terrifying aura, and a willingness to fight anyone. Very quickly, he became one of Pride's biggest stars. In the early 2000s, Silva went on a run that cemented him as one of the most feared fighters on the planet. He captured the Pride Middleweight Championship and held it for nearly 5 years, an eternity in MMA. He went undefeated for over 18 fights during his prime, tearing through opponents with savage knees, soccer kicks, and ground and pound that looked like pure rage unleashed. His rivalry with Kazushi Sakuraba became legendary. Sakuraba, already a Japanese icon for defeating the Gracies, was supposed to be unstoppable, but Silva dismantled him 3 times, each more brutal than the last. It wasn't just wins, they were demolitions, the kind of fights that etched Silva's name into highlight reels forever. Pride's rule set allowed stomps and soccer kicks to the head of grounded opponents, and Silva used them like weapons. He became the face of violent artistry, adored by Japanese fans who saw his fury as entertainment and dominance rolled into one. But there was a darker side to this reign. Critics whispered about the culture of Pride, where performance-enhancing drugs were rampant and where fighters were sometimes pushed into extremes. Wanderlei's unrelenting violence, while celebrated, was also beginning to raise questions, and those questions would grow louder as his rivalries intensified and the chaos of Wanderlei Silva's world reached new heights. If Wanderlei Silva's reign in Pride built his legend, it was his rivalries that carved it in stone. Chief among them, Rampage Jackson. Their first fight in 2003 became an instant classic, not because it was competitive, but because of how Silva dismantled Rampage with knees from the clinch. Each strike landed like a hammer, and by the end, Rampage was left slumped against the ropes, bloodied, barely conscious. Fans weren't just entertained, they were horrified, yet couldn't look away. The rematch in 2004 was even more violent. Once again, Silva's Muay Thai clinch was unstoppable, and the knees rained down like a storm. Rampage collapsed, hanging over the ropes, battered beyond recognition. These fights weren't just victories, they were statements. Wanderlei Silva wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting to destroy careers. But Rampage wasn't the only rival. Dan Henderson gave Silva his most crushing pride loss, knocking him out cold in 2007. Mirko Krokop, the Croatian striker, tested Silva in brutal wars that ended with Silva's face swollen and bloodied. Even in defeat, though, Wanderlei's willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, at any time, earned him respect. Fans loved him because he was chaos personified. Opponents feared him because he never quit, and promoters adored him because he guaranteed violence. But whispers about PRIDE's culture began growing louder. Rumors of rampant PED use and unchecked medical practices raised questions. Were Silva's superhuman performances truly natural, or was he a product of the wild, unregulated world of Japanese MMA? Whatever the truth, by the time Pride folded, Wanderlei Silva was both feared and adored, and ready to carry his chaos back to the UFC. When Pride collapsed in 2007, the UFC welcomed Wanderlei Silva back with open arms. Fans salivated at the matchups. Silva against Chuck Liddell, Rampage again, Rich Franklin, Michael Bisping, and the UFC delivered. His first fight back against Liddell wasn't just a fight, it was a dream for MMA fans. The bout lived up to the hype, a 3-round slugfest with both men throwing bombs until the final bell. Liddell won by decision, but Silva's stock didn't fall. He proved he could bring Pride's chaos into the UFC's octagon. Over the next years, Silva's UFC run became a highlight reel of wars. He knocked out Keith Jardine in just 36 seconds with a furious blitz. He fought Rampage a third time, though this time the tables turned, with Rampage knocking Silva out cold. Against Rich Franklin, Silva gave everything, losing by decision in a razor-close battle. And in 2013, against Brian Stan in Japan, he delivered one of the greatest slugfests in MMA history, knocking Stan out in a wild, bloody brawl that reminded fans of his Pride glory days. Yet the dominance of old wasn't there. Silva was slower, older, more vulnerable. His chin, once granite, began to crack. Still, he never stopped marching forward, never stopped throwing with bad intentions. Fans adored him for it, but it was clear the axe murderer was human after all. Still, even as his in-cage performances slowed, his personality outside the cage only grew louder. Wanderlei wasn't just fighting opponents anymore. He was fighting organization, referees, and even fellow fighters outside of sanctioned bouts. And soon, the chaos outside the cage would overshadow the violence inside it. Wanderlei Silva was never just a fighter. He was a storm, and that storm followed him everywhere he went. Training partners told stories of sparring sessions that turned into all-out wars. Opponents spoke about how Silva would glare at them during weigh-ins, as if he wanted to fight before the bell even rang. But it wasn't just theatrics. On The Ultimate Fighter Brazil 3 in 2014, Silva's feud with Chael Sonnen exploded into a real brawl on set. Cameras captured Silva throwing wild punches, Sonnen retaliating, and the coaching staff scrambling to pull them apart. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged, it was Wanderlei being Wanderlei, uncontrollable, furious, and unfiltered. Outside the UFC, his antics continued. He blasted Dana White in interviews, accusing the UFC of underpaying fighters and exploiting them. He released emotional videos on social media, some rambling, some scathing, attacking the organization and claiming corruption. To his fans, he was a hero standing up for fighters' rights. To critics, he was a bitter veteran lashing out after his prime. This chaos, this unpredictability, became part of his identity. Fans didn't just tune in for his fights, they tuned in to see what Wanderlei Silva would do or say next. He was volatile, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. But behind the theatrics, a storm was brewing that would threaten to erase his career entirely. Because soon, Silva wouldn't just be fighting rivals or organizations, he would be fighting for his very right to compete. And the darkest chapter of his career was about to begin, one scandal that nearly ended everything. By 2014, Wanderlei Silva was preparing for one of the biggest grudge matches of his career, a long-awaited UFC UFC clash with Chael Sonnen. The feud had boiled over during the Ultimate Fighter Brazil, where fists flew and insults turned personal. Fans expected fireworks, but instead of violence in the cage, the fight ended in scandal outside of it. In May of that year, Nevada State Athletic Commission officials arrived at Silva's gym for a surprise drug test. What happened next stunned the MMA world. Wanderlei Silva didn't take the test. He didn't even argue. He ran, literally walked out of the gym and refused to comply. When news broke, the fallout was immediate. The NSAC banned him indefinitely, eventually escalating to a lifetime ban, later overturned, but the damage was done. Rumors flew. Was Wanderlei hiding a positive test for steroids, painkillers, or something else? His explanation, that he was on medication but not performance-enhancing drugs, did little to calm the storm. Fans were divided. Some believed him, pointing to the chaotic, poorly regulated testing environment fighters had long complained about. Others saw his flight as proof of guilt. The timing couldn't have been worse. Pride's history of lax drug testing had already cast shadows over its stars, and Wanderlei's refusal to test became Exhibit A for critics who believed his violent reign had been chemically fueled. Dana White and the UFC publicly distanced themselves, and Sonnen, always the trash talker, mocked Silva relentlessly, calling him a fraud who had run from the truth. But to Wanderlei, this wasn't just about a test. He claimed it was about dignity, about refusing to play along with a system he believed was corrupt. In fiery videos posted online, he accused the UFC and athletic commissions of exploitation, of caring more about money than fighter safety. And whether fans saw him as a fallen hero or a fighter caught in his own downfall, one thing was certain. Wanderlei Silva was now fighting the biggest battle of his career, not in a cage, but against the system itself. After the drug test scandal, Wanderlei Silva transformed from a beloved fighter into something more polarizing, a whistleblower, a rebel, a man at war with the UFC. His once close relationship with Dana White crumbled. He accused White of treating fighters like disposable commodities, of profiting off their blood while paying them a fraction of the revenue. His words struck a chord with many veterans, but alienated others who saw his rants as bitterness. In emotional YouTube videos, Silva went all in. He said he would never fight for the UFC again. He accused matchmakers of fixing opportunities, of forcing fighters into unfair contracts, of using intimidation tactics. Some fans cheered him for speaking out, especially as stories about fighter pay and mistreatment gained traction. Others saw a desperate man clinging to relevance after burning every bridge. Meanwhile, his fighting future hung in limbo. With the NSAC ban lifted years later, he technically could compete again. Bellator MMA and Rizin in Japan gave him opportunities, but the magic was gone. Older, slower, his legendary chin cracked. Silva was no longer the axe murderer who terrorized Pride, but what remained undeniable was his impact outside the cage. His feud with the UFC became symbolic of a larger battle, fighters demanding respect and fair treatment. While some dismissed him as reckless, others called him a pioneer for fighter rights, a man willing to sacrifice his career to speak his truth. Still, the shadow of the drug test controversy lingered. For every fan who praised his defiance, there was another who saw only a fighter who ran from accountability. And as Silva's fighting days drew to a close, the question that haunted his legacy was simple. Would history remember him as a warrior or as a cautionary tale? Wanderlei Silva retired with a record of 35 wins, 14 losses, and 1 draw, not counting the exhibition fights. But those numbers don't tell the story. His legacy isn't measured in wins or losses. It's measured in chaos, in violence, in the unforgettable moments burned into MMA history. In Pride, he was untouchable. His stare-downs alone sent chills through opponents. His knees in the clinch became the stuff of nightmares. His rivalry with Rampage Jackson remains one of the bloodiest, most iconic in combat sports. His wars with Liddell, Cro Cop, and Stan defined eras. When you think of the most violent highlight reels in MMA history, Wanderlei Silva's name is always there. But his story is also one of contradictions. A fighter who was beloved in Japan, but controversial in America. A warrior who gave fans everything in the ring, but who fought officials and organizations outside of it. A legend who stood for pride and passion, yet forever stained by the scandal of a drug test he refused to take. Today, Wanderlei lives as both icon and rebel. In Brazil, he's celebrated as a hero of the sport. To hardcore fans, he's still the axe murderer, the man who defined an era of chaos. To critics, he's a symbol of MMA's darker side, the PED scandals, the unchecked violence, the cost fighters pay long after the cheers fade. Perhaps that is Wanderlei's true legacy. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't polished, he was raw, unpredictable, terrifying, terrifying, and human. He showed the beauty and the ugliness of combat sports all at once. Because when Wanderlei Silva walked into the ring, fans didn't just expect a fight, they expected a war. And in giving them that, over and over again, he secured his place in history. Not as the cleanest fighter, not as the most technical, but as the embodiment of chaos itself. Wanderlei Silva will never be remembered as flawless, but he will always be remembered as unforgettable.